Hello, my friends. This is Deepak Chopra, and it's a great pleasure, privilege, honor, and joy for me to introduce a friend of mine, Lindsay Briner. Lindsay Briner. I've known her for many years now. And not only is she a good friend and colleague, she's a very smart person, understands consciousness, understands science, understands technology, is a counselor right now using neurotechnology. And I thought it would be very useful to have a conversation with her because it shows you where the future is going in terms of understanding who we are, our own consciousness, various practices we can do to liberate ourselves from suffering, and also the technology innovations that are coming our way to make the future of well-being and the future of self-awareness a very exciting process. So thank you for joining me, Lindsay. How are you?
Hi, Deepak. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah. So let's give our viewers a little background of your education, where you grew up, and how you got to be where we are today, having this conversation on all these amazing things. I know we met at a Science of Consciousness conference, but you were at that time already exploring quantum mechanics and deeper understanding of consciousness. Give us a little background on your how you got into this whole area and where you are now.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Well, I'm out in California in the Bay Area. I grew up here. And yeah, I met you at the Science and Non-Duality Conference. I guess I'll start there. And you did a workshop on the neuroscience of enlightenment. And at the end of your workshop, I approached you with a question of, something about the vacuum fluctuation and the microtubules of the neural cells, and referred to our friend Stuart Hameroff's work and the hard problem of consciousness. And that's kind of how we started our conversation. At the time, I was working with a physicist out in Kauai, and I had just finished my master's degree. I got my master's degree at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology for counseling psychology, and decided not to get licensed because I was more interested in research, and then ended up at this lab out in Hawaii, and then came back to finish my PhD in Palo Alto at the Transformative Technology Lab, studied higher states of consciousness at that lab, analyzing a large data set on meditation and positive psychology. And then while I was at that lab, it was at the inception of this movement in Silicon Valley, the trans tech movement and consciousness hacking with Nicole Bradford and Jeffrey Martin. And so during that time when I was studying consciousness and awakening essentially, and the neuroscience and the heart rate variability and Galvanic skin response, we had all this data and then all the psychology of it. But then I met all these entrepreneurs and executives and industry leaders in the transformative technology space. So developed an expertise in this industry. And so I do a lot of consulting in that intersection of human transformation, well-being, and technology for companies. But then I also help executives. I do coaching. I do performance coaching with executives. So help them kind of be the embodiment of this fundamental well-being and what I call like a stabilized flow when they reach this, what you call, meta-human, waking up into the true self, so that they can be a leader in a good way with high performance, but not only in what they're doing, but in all areas of their life, essentially. And so that's how I got into what I do. And I think on a personal level, I started out as a long distance runner. And so that was my first exposure to like flow states. And then when I got injured, I could no longer long distance run. So I got into meditation and yoga, and just wanted to help people at a young age. And then being a runner, ended up just following my passion, and here I am.
So right now you do have a consulting business, and how can people find out more about you? What's your website? Can you give it out?
LindsayBriner.com. Yeah, Lindsay with an A.
Lindsay, L-I-N-D-S-A.
AYBRINER. Yeah.
.com. And give me an example of how, say, a client would come to you. Let's say I'm a CEO and I'm running a small business and I have a team, but I'm having some anxiety, some existential dilemmas, and also not very sure if I'm following my purpose. I come to you, and how do you help me?
Yeah, so working one-on-one with individual executives and CEOs of companies is really my passion because I get to use a personalized approach. And so I use a combination of instruction on meditation and coming up with a daily practice using a variety of different meditation techniques to find what works best for them and combine that with research backed positive psychology exercises as well. So that's the daily practice. That's one end of it. And then the other end is really working with them on a deep level to identify the limiting belief systems that are holding them back. And this is kind of doing some detective work to identify like the false self narrative. Where are we holding ourselves back? Where are we stuck in the conditioned mind of fear, doubt, and disbelief? Often these limitations come from our childhood or even societal conditioning of what it means to be successful or fear of failure and all of these things. So we really identify this false self narrative that's in the self-referential thinking, this default mode network of the brain, which is in the temporal lobe, and it's that kind of constant mental chatter. And so we kind of get into the root of that subconscious mind and start to rewire it, both with doing these deep sessions, but also with the meditation and positive psychology to build new neural networks. It's kind of like I call it neurohacking, these building new habits and using meditation to increase awareness, to just snap out of that false self and awaken into the true self, which is free from these limitations. It's really...
Where does technology fit in? What are some of the technologies you're using currently? I remember at one time you were very into transcranial magnetic stimulation, etc. These days, people are talking about digital therapeutics. And then, of course, there's all this neural feedback domain. What exactly do you use as technology?
Yeah, it's really personal and what's reasonable for the person's lifestyle. I have referred clients to neurofeedback, whether it's a home device with the Muse headset, or going to a clinic and I help them find one. And then there's also, I think when we were talking about the brain stimulation stuff, that was with Jay Sanguinetti and Stuart Hameroff's lab and doing ultrasound brain stimulation, which it's still, in the early stages of research. So there's tons of different wearables and a variety of things that people can get, like, measuring heart rate to really track, because that false self narrative is essentially how we're hooked into the nervous system and being in fight or flight. And so that all translates into heart rate and respiration and, brain states and structures. And so we can actually track our progress into this transition out of the false self narrative, out of fight or flight, and into what I like to call stabilized flow. Because it's like, I think a lot of people are familiar with flow states, where you're like just fully in this high performance, excellence, peak performance state, like totally absorbed with a task, but it's temporary and then it goes away. And so I kind of help these executives and CEOs get into more of a stabilized flow where they're in their true self, they're in this effortless flow, not just in their work in this one specific task, but in all areas of their life, because they've learned how to self-regulate their heart rate and their breathing through meditation and all these exercises to build new healthy habits. So it's kind of creates a stabilized flow, or like a flow mindset generally, so that they can have mastery over all areas of their life, not just in their work and business.
let me relate this to a little bit about, some of the funda- fundamental and foundational principles, both in Buddhism and in Kashmir Shaivism and Vedanta. So when you look at these wisdom traditions, when they look at the body, the physical body, or what we call the physical body, they call it the conceptual body, because there is no such thing as a physical body. What we call the physical body is a human construct for a changing mode of knowing and perception in awareness. We don't actually have a body. I mean, if you say you have a body, then which one? You started as a fertilized egg, and then you were a zygote and an embryo and a baby and a toddler and a teenager and adult, all the way to dusty death. So what we call the physical body is a changing perceptual experience in consciousness. The Buddhists and Vedantists also call it the pain and pleasure body. So if I ask somebody to close their eyes and think of a painful experience they had, they feel certain sensations. Then if I ask them to think of a pleasurable experience, then they have a different kind of sensation. One is tight, one is relaxed, whatever. And it's the internal dialogue, which you call the narrative of the false self, that is projecting itself as this karmic body or this conceptual body, because it's not real. It's just a shifting snapshots of perception given a storyline. And so what you're calling the false narrative is based on perceptual experience and interpretation of perceptual experience. And we know that all perceptual experience is unreliable and false. My senses tell me the earth is flat. Nobody believes that anymore. My senses tell me the ground I'm sitting on is stationary, and I know it's spinning at dizzying speeds and hurtling through space at thousands of miles an hour. My senses tell me that you have a physical, three-dimensional solid body. I know it's proportionately as void as intergalactic space. So everything I see is a magical lie, but then I interpret these magical lies. I create feelings and images and sensations and thoughts, and these then become my life. And the neural correlate of that is what you call the default mode network, which we can bypass if we stop the internal dialogue, or you go beyond the internal dialogue. Then there you experience what we call mind, body, physical world, and intellect and ego, and the universe as a unified experience in consciousness. And the bliss body is actually the body that has no narrative period. So if I can close my eyes and go beyond the narrative into the stillness beyond and experience my body as totally empty and formless, then I am in a way liberated from what we call human suffering. Now, the Buddhists have their own framework, Four Noble Truths, Eightfold Noble Path. The Vedantists talk about the five kleshas, not knowing the true self, clutching and grasping experience, which is ungraspable, recoiling from experience, which is ungraspable, identifying with this false narrative and the fear of death. And they say that if you actually understood that everything that's wrong is just a magical lie, which makes experience possible, but it's not the truth, then you're liberated. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I thank you for such clear articulation and this transition. There's so many ways to say it, right? And another way that I conceptualize it is the sense of self as an identity construct and all of the conceptualizations of who we are and how we show up in the world, and then shifting over into the sense of self as the field of pure awareness. And so the sense of self is the interface. It's the user interface with this three-dimensional reality. And so it's the central organizing principle of our lives. And so it's how we interpret reality, and it's our mode of perception is what I heard you say, right? As your mode of perception, all of your identity constructs. Or is your mode of perception the field of pure awareness?
Mhm. So when you have pure awareness as the mode of knowing, then there's no resistance to existence. It's basically that
Exactly.
flow, right? No
Yeah,
resistance
the
to existence.
stabilized flow. Yeah, totally.
No anticipation, no regrets, but just the fullness of this moment. Now, when you talk to athletes, or I talk to athletes in peak performance experiences, they do talk about no resistance, no flow, being in the zone. But they also say time slows down, perception slows down, sound disappears,
Yeah.
and a feeling of joy and transcendence or ecstasy. That's the moment that, wisdom traditions call Samadhi, where the observer, the mode of observation, and that which is observed become one field of pure potentiality. And that's who we are. We are the observer, the mode of observation, and that which is observed simultaneously. Knower, knowing, and known. Seer, seeing, and scenery. We are that. We are not the observer. The observer is another magical lie. And the mode of observation, there are innumerable. We call them minds. And then things that are known depend on the interpretation by the so-called logical mind, or even what we call empirical facts, which are species-specific magical lies too. Empirical fact is just a blip, a space-time event in consciousness, what we call a snapshot of perception. But the storyline is by this false self. And the whole goal of existence is to liberate ourselves from the false self. So we go beyond suffering and fear of death as well.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for nailing it.
So
Yeah.
recently you've been talking about your Buddhist practices. Before we get there, I want to ask you your take on psychedelics, because recently I've been also looking at what is called end of life terminal lucidity. I've been looking at the effects of psychedelics on depression and anxiety, and also recently I've taken people in the last stages of life through the transition from this domain to the next domain. Any insights from your part on psychedelics and these new technologies?
Yeah, I think my kind of take on psychedelics is, well, I'm very happy with the direction that the industry is going and the legalization, and I think they have incredible benefit. I'd love to hear more about this end of life work. I haven't heard of that. It sounds really beautiful. And as my teacher would say, Daniel P. Brown, who's my Mahamudra Dzogchen Buddhist teacher, is that the concern here is like an addiction or an attachment to a state. That's just a temporary experience. And so what I really like to teach my clients and the teams that I work with is that these states can actually be accessed naturally and in a stabilized way. And so that's kind of like the stance that I like to take, because these altered states can actually become altered traits in a healthy, very grounded way if you're, willing and determined to do the practices, But it's really interesting. I mean, at the intersection of technology, we're able to now simulate similar psychedelic experiences using technology for people who don't want to take the chemicals or the plant medicine, and so there's all kinds of like virtual reality experiences now that are being used to simulate really similar experiences, to take the person beyond this false self narrative and this these magical tricks of the illusion of reality, and wake up into the sense of self as like the wholeness of the interconnectedness of all life. Like there's microdose. Andrew Jones's company is doing these huge dome experiences that are incredibly beautiful. And I know that over at UCSF, they're doing a lot of research at the intersection of like stimulating psychedelic experiences with technology as well. So that's going to be an interesting field.
So talking about this terminal lucidity, I actually came across it recently, talking to hospice workers and people who work in nursing homes and also neuroscientists. Here's what it is. You know, some people, even if they have Alzheimer's or a stroke or seemingly vegetative, for a few seconds or sometimes few minutes or sometimes few hours and sometimes few days, they suddenly become extremely lucid. They have contact with dead relatives, even dead pets, and they're very comfortable with transition to the next dimension. And not only that, they feel comforted that physical death is just, in a way, the release of an illusion, that what we call physical reality is actually, as I said, a perceptual activity in consciousness, and that there are infinite domains to be explored. Now, my mother had this experience and my grandmother had this experience. And now I've sat with some people in their final stages of life with, ketamine, sometimes microdosing with ketamine. And clearly they have this experience. And when they look at their brains, they have something called gamma frequency. So normal, right now our conversation, our brain waves would be, say, between 12 and 14. In meditative states, they're between 8 and 12. In dream states, between 4 and 8. In deep sleep, less than 4. But this is something totally different. It's 40 cycles per second, 40 hertz per second. And it's now well documented. So when I started to think about this and the hard problem of consciousness, what occurred to me is there is no hard problem of consciousness if you don't believe in matter as the ontological primitive of the universe, because matter is a construct for a perceptual activity in the mind. So we create matter as a construct in the mind. Now we want matter to explain the mind, which created the construct in the first place. So, solving the hard problem is actually hard only if you have the wrong premise that the world is physical. If the world is subtle, then all these domains of awareness are available to us, And therefore, when string theory and modern theories talk about infinite universes, in a sense, they're talking about physical domains, but actually they're all frequency domains in consciousness. In the Yoga Vaishishta, the great yogi says, infinite universes come and go in the vast expanse of consciousness. They're lokas, L-O-K-A-S, Sanskrit word for location or locus, but they're not frequency domains that are physical. They're frequency domains of consciousness. And for me, doing these practices myself, meditating on my death, inducing gamma frequency through either breath work or through meditation or through technology or through even psychedelics, is a window to the real reality beyond the perceptual experience.
Yeah. Well, even the cutting edge of, research out of Princeton and, in cognitive neuroscience and general relativity and physics, we're now saying that space-time is doomed, right? That there's something more fundamental. We've been saying for centuries that space-time is the fundamental, and now we're realizing that there's something more fundamental and that space-time is emergent from that. And the appearance level, it's the ground level of reality and then the appearance level of reality. And we've mistaken the appearance level of reality for the ground. And we're realizing that it's the opposite. But when we flip the script and we're able to see the appearance level as the illusion, it's like this, and realize it's this virtual reality simulation that we've created as a consensus conditioning, then we're able to see, like, what you just said, the absolute reality, just things in their true nature, and be in that stabilized flow. And have these paranormal experiences that you're referring to. That sounds so incredible to witness. That sounds really cool.
So this has been an amazing conversation, a recap of things we've spoken of before. Before I end this conversation, just want to remind our audience that you're a neuroscientist by training. You are a student of consciousness for as long as I've known you. And now you have a consulting practices where you actually practice, where you help people find their true self and go beyond the usual modes of human suffering. And your website is lindsaybriner.com. And I look forward to maybe working with you more and seeing how we can engage you in some of these conversations and send you some people who could use your help.
Thank you, Deepak. It's always so much fun to talk to you.
Always good. And let's meet soon sometime.